Hello and welcome to our first lecture on the Baroque era. Today I'm going to talk about what that word means, what the significance of these dates is, 1600 to 1750, and mostly about the historical, cultural background, and hopefully by the end of the lecture getting into the music a little bit, how all of this applies to music. So let's start with the word Baroque, which unlike Renaissance or classical, which is the next era we're going to get to, the word Baroque is one that you don't use very often in everyday speech, and it requires some explanation. The book's explanation of the term is a little unsatisfying to me. Let's start with that, though. I'm on page 101, and it says here, though the word Baroque has at various times meant bizarre, flamboyant, and elaborately ornamented, modern historians use it simply to indicate a particular style in the arts. Well, that's all true, but there's more to it than that. So, first of all, the word itself comes from a Portuguese term. So, Baroque with a Q-U-E on the end is French. The Portuguese version of this same word is barroco, with two C's and an O on the end. And it was a term that originally applied to the classification of different grades of pearls. So as you are probably aware, pearls are formed when a grain of sand gets inside of an oyster. It's an irritant to the oyster, so the oyster tries to cover it up with these layers of mother of pearl, which is basically, I guess, like mucus. Kind of puts pearls in a whole new light when you think about it that way. So the oyster covers up this grain of sand with this pretty mucus, and if you start out with a perfectly round bead, such as is done when cultured pearls. So most of the pearls that you see, people wearing these days are cultured pearls, and they're made with, someone has a bed of oysters and they take a nice round bead and they stick it inside the oyster, and with layer on layer of mother of pearl. If you start out with a nice round bead, you'll get a pretty nice round pearl. But if you have natural pearls that start out with a grain of sand, each little imperfection on that grain of sand is going to be multiplied by the additional layers of mother of pearl, and you might end up with, in fact, all natural pearls are to some degree lumpy. If it's especially lumpy, it's called a barroco. At least it was in those days. And it would probably bring less money than the other grades of pearls. That's why we have a classification system, so that we know how much to ask. Now, there's kind of an interesting implication to this term then, that it's talking about a pearl, which is something beautiful, right? But it is unfortunately imperfect. It is lumpy, misshapen, distorted somehow. So this term is not meant as a compliment, right? It's a criticism, or sort of a term of ridicule in a way, and it was applied to this era. Specifically, it first applied to music of this era by essentially people who are coming along either towards the very end of the era, as defined by the book anyway, 1600 to 1750. Again, I'll talk about those dates in a minute. But it was applied by people coming along after, when the era was basically over with, when the style was at least beginning to change or had changed substantially. And so people looking from the perspective of the newer style are looking back on the older style and making a criticism of it, that it was too, again, exaggerated or misshapen or distorted in some way. So it really reflects maybe the values of the people making the criticism, which would have been, more maybe Enlightenment values or classical era values. Again, stuff we're going to talk about in the next unit. It's applied retroactively to the art, or the music in this case, of a previous era. And although this term is used, it's applied to all of the arts, right? The visual arts, drama, etc. I believe its origin really is with music. So apparently the first time this was used was in a review, an anonymous review of an opera by the Baroque composer Rameau, maybe the greatest French composer of this time. And this critic wrote that this piece was Baroque. And that was the first time this was used. Now, later, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, hugely influential philosopher, in 1762, Rousseau was asked to contribute an article on music to an encyclopedia that was being compiled by Denis Diderot. Rousseau, in addition to being a philosopher, was quite knowledgeable about music. He had written some music himself, so he was asked to write an article on music, and he described Baroque music this way. So he's the first to use it more in a scholarly sense than just in a review. And he wrote in 1768, so this is after the Baroque era was over, essentially, Baroque music is that in which the harmony is confused and loaded with modulations and dissonances. The singing is harsh and unnatural, the intonation difficult, and the movement limited. It appears the term comes from the word barocco used by logicians. So he may have misunderstood the origins of the term, not logicians, but pearl merchants, actually. That's the word. Let's talk about the dates, and then we'll actually come back to the word. We'll see how this applies to the various arts, how it applies to music. But let's talk about the dates, 1600 and 1750. So I've made the point many times, like in the previous unit, that anytime we are bracketing off a historical era with certain dates, there's going to be some wiggle room. Remember, this is an artificial construct, really. It's not like we can say that the dates of the Revolutionary War are such and such, the dates of the Civil War, and that's kind of like, there's an opening shot or whatever, and then there's a peace treaty, and we're pretty safe ground usually on deciding when such things begin and end. But with a historical era, that's something that there can be quite a bit of debate about, and sometimes the years are what they are simply because it's convenient to start at the beginning of a particular century or halfway through another century. So one thing to make note of is it's 150 years, which happens to be the same length that the Renaissance was, right? Remember, the Renaissance was 1450 to 1600, and now the Baroque era is 1600 to 1750. How convenient, right? What a coincidence. So these dates are kind of artificial, but they're sort of coincidentally, there is some purely musical significance to these dates. And therefore, I think it's worth making note of these, if for no other reason than to make the dates stick in your head a little bit. 1600 is the year that the very first opera was composed. And opera is, unlike most other musical genres, it didn't really so much evolve from some predecessor genre. I mean, in some ways it did, but opera, more than any other genre of music, was really invented for a specific reason, which we will talk about when we get to the history of opera. And therefore, we can kind of pin a date on the first opera. Now, this first opera, unfortunately, did not survive. That is, the written score, we know it existed, but we don't have the score of this opera anymore. But the same people who created that opera created other operas, so we have like the first opera and then the first surviving opera, which is shortly after, just a year or two after. But 1600 is convenient for that reason. It's the year of the first opera, and opera is so hugely significant. It has such an effect on all other musical genres in the Baroque era that's actually a pretty good year to pick. And we'll talk about how influential opera is later on when we get to it. So let's zoom ahead now to the year 1750. What is significant about the year 1750? That year happens to be the year that the greatest composer of the Baroque era, and most classical musicians would argue the greatest composer of all time, J.S. Bach, died in 1750. Right? Now, Again, it's useful to know, and that's probably the reason why this date is chosen. There's really no other reason to choose this particular date other than Bach died that year, and it's halfway through the century, so it makes a convenient stopping point. But if you're aware of that fact, it actually ties into some of what we're going to learn about Bach later on, which is that by the end of his lifetime, J.S. Bach, his style was already beginning to be considered kind of old-fashioned, and the musical style had moved on into what we will examine as the characteristics of the classical style. Right? Bach himself, although hugely recognized as being hugely important today, in his own time he was not particularly well known. Right? He was known within northern Germany. He was known by musicians, like insiders, but he was not at all world famous or anything like that. So at the time, his death was really not all that significant in the musical world. Obviously, it was significant to him, but it was not like, oh, did you hear that Bach has died? Well, this must be the time to usher in a new musical era. Nothing like that. The musical style had already been, for decades, moving in the direction towards the newer style of the classical era, which is very different from the late Baroque style, which J.S. Bach represented. And which, in fact, J.S. Bach's own sons, two of them in particular, really helped usher in. Right? So, nothing earth-shattering happened in 1750 besides the death of Bach, but that's a good enough stopping point that we'll use it. All right, so what are the characteristics of the society of the time? Remember, we want to understand what's going on in history, what's going on in society, because this is the context from which the music arises and all that. Well, remember I've talked in the previous units about these different groups, these different classes in society. The basic structure of society in Europe is you have three classes. You have the commoners, you have the nobility, and you have the clergy. So we saw in the Renaissance, one of the main things that characterizes the transition from the medieval to the Renaissance is a loss in the power and prestige of the clergy. Right? Now, the clergy are still pretty powerful and prestigious, but they are no longer king of the hill. It's the aristocracy, the nobility, right? And we see that trend in the Renaissance. And meanwhile, the commoners are still mostly working the land. I mean, there are commoners who are skilled tradesmen, who are merchants, who are lawyers, who are doctors, who are whatever. Not everybody is working the fields, but this is still an agrarian society. Raising enough food to feed everybody is extremely labor intensive. So that's still what the vast majority of the population is doing in Europe. Right? But if we're going to be talking about music and musical culture, we will really be talking more about those classes of people who are producing the music, or in some cases, maybe the audience for the music. So when we get into this period of time, 1600 to 1750, we might speak of a Baroque era within the arts, within music, within the visual arts, etc. But as a general historical era, you wouldn't use the term Baroque because it's really a term that just applies to the arts. Unlike Renaissance, the term Renaissance applies equally to the general historical period and to the period within the arts. That's not true of the Baroque. The general historical term that we would use for this period of time, like if we're not talking about music history, we're talking about general history, we might use the term the age of absolutism. Because this is the time when it's not just the nobility who is gaining in power and wealth and status and all that. That's true, and that was true in the Renaissance, but it's really the very upper layer of the nobility, kings, emperors, right? So absolute rulers, and the lower tiers of nobility, like if you're not actually the ruler of your domain. Now, not every domain is a kingdom, let's say, or an empire. You could be a duke and have effective rule over, and of course, this is a time before many of what, the modern nations of Germany or Italy, for example. There was no such thing in these times, but you had a king of Bavaria, a king of Prussia, right? A king of Hanover. In Italy, you had a king of Naples. There were various small kingdoms or duchies or principalities, right, which later united to form modern day Italy and modern day Germany. So the picture is a little bit more complicated than it is today, but nonetheless, it's the very upper nobility which really has all the power, and the lesser nobility less so, because these absolute rulers want to consolidate power in their hands, and now they have to they can't abolish the lower ranking nobility. They have to find a means to deal with them, which we will see how one king in particular, Louis XIV. Louis XIV is seen as sort of like the epitome of the absolute ruler, right? And we'll talk about him a bit, but since it is increasingly, the most powerful nobility who are, this is the time when they reach the zenith of their power. Let's put it that way. When we get into the next era, the classical era within music, and we might call the Enlightenment era, right? We see this is when the aristocracies in some parts of Europe begin to fall from their position as king of the hill, and the middle class, the commoners, begin asserting their rights, begin to resent the second class citizen status that they've had for so long. But that's still yet to come. This period of time, the age of absolutism, is the time when kings and queens and princes and dukes and the emperor, if we're talking about the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna, this is when they are at the peak of their power. And therefore, much of the art, much of the music, not all of it, but much of it, is geared towards them, because they are the patrons. They are the ones who are paying for it, right? They are the ones who are hiring the best musicians, the best artists, right? The best whatever, in order to project their own grandeur. That's what a lot of this art and these statues and these palaces were about, right? It was about someone, for example, like Louis XIV, trying to impress upon anyone who would enter the grounds of his palace at Versailles. There's a picture of Versailles here at the top of page 103. Enormous palace complex, full of gardens and statues and ponds and elaborate fountains, and this enormous edifice which Louis XIV built on the site of what was his grandfather's hunting lodge. Versailles is out a few miles from Paris. So Louis decided to build this tremendous palace for a couple of reasons. First of all, again, to impress his magnificence upon the world. So you can imagine looking at this picture, or Google pictures of Versailles. Imagine you're an ambassador from some foreign country, and you've just been posted to Versailles, and you step out of your carriage and you look upon all of this grandeur, and you're going to be kind of in awe. You're going to be intimidated. Like, who is the man who commissioned all of this, who ordered that this be built? Another reason for Versailles was that the way that Louis, having been one of the this is a time when power now is consolidating, rather than, let's say, earlier in the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages, the King of France did not necessarily have absolute power all over France. In fact, regional dukes, I think I've talked about the Duke of Aquitaine, for example, was a kind of a rival for power in terms of, in real absolute terms, not theoretical terms, because a duke is, of course, of lower rank than a king. But in real terms, in many countries in Europe, again, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the monarch did not have absolute power. So, for example, the King of England always had to sort of negotiate with Parliament, with the various lords and earls and dukes, in order to collect taxes. If he wanted to fight a war, he had to deal with these people. He couldn't just command them. He might cause rebellion or whatever. King of France, the same situation. But as we move into this age of absolutism, for various reasons I won't get into too much, the King of France really becomes the absolute ruler of all of France. And one of the ways that he keeps this grip on power is by, the lesser nobles building a big palace and inviting them all to stay with him, so that they aren't off in their own provinces making trouble, maybe running things their own way, or maybe plotting rebellion or whatever. Sort of like, if you know the movie The Godfather, that line, keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. That was part of the idea behind Versailles, and that's why there's hundreds and hundreds of guest rooms, so that, the Duke of so-and-so or this count from the provinces, if you are invited to come to Versailles, that's an invitation you can't refuse. And so you and your entourage come, and you get a lovely apartment at Versailles. And yeah, you're allowed to go back to your own lands every once in a while, but Louis wants you close so that he can keep an eye on you, in essence. So all of this, it's a means of consolidating and projecting, at least psychologically, power. Right? And all of the monarchs of Europe vied with each other for the greatest artists, the greatest musicians, whatever. So this is definitely a time when it is far more lucrative and prestigious to be a court composer rather than a church composer. There are still many church composers, and they're writing, great music, whatever, but if you could have your choice, you would want to be a court composer. Now, just because you're a court composer doesn't mean that you are, treated special like an artist, right? This modern idea that we have of the artist as some sort of an elevated being that people, sort of defer to and have this awe of artists or of great musicians, sort of like what we have for athletes or other high-achieving people, that we are in awe of them, and there was really not anything like that in the Baroque. Even the most prestigious, famous court composer would have been treated as basically a high-class servant. And in many cases, if you're working for some nobleman, you are their court composer. You might have to wear a uniform every day, You would have to compose music, not necessarily the kind of music or even in the style that you would prefer, because you have a boss. And the boss has certain tastes and preferences and types of pieces that he wants to hear. And so you're taking orders. You don't have this kind of artistic freedom to just do whatever you feel inspired to do, right? So the artist does not have this lofty, elevated, sort of almost mythical position. That, again, is something that comes later. That's more the Romantic era conception of the artist. That's something that comes like in the 19th century. So let's again touching on the book and using it as our point of departure. I think I've touched on most of this stuff on page 101, 102. This is important. It says here, the middle class, too, influenced the development of Baroque style. In the Netherlands, for example, prosperous merchants and doctors commissioned realistic landscapes and scenes from everyday life. Now, let's talk about this concept of the middle class. Again, we're still talking about these different classes of society and the historical background, and we'll get to the music soon enough. the word middle class, you hear it all the time today, right? You hear politicians talking about the middle class this, the middle class that. The reason they do that is because they know that 90% of modern day Americans, when asked to identify themselves in their own class, will say, well, I'm middle class. You know, it's a very, very wide range of people. So if you're a politician and you want to appeal to 90% of the people, you're going to talk about middle class this, and I'm fighting for the middle class, right? So we might have a very different view of what middle class means. We think, like, most people are middle class. That's the biggest class in America by far. Now, the other thing about America is, of course, it's a much, much less class-conscious society, thank God, than anywhere in Europe, even today, but certainly 300, 400 years ago, right? Again, people are very, very conscious of class in this time. And the middle class during this period of time is very, very small, right? Remember what I said, you know, the vast majority of people are still peasants working the land because that requires the most labor. The clergy have never been a very big percentage of the population. The nobility, likewise, really a teeny slice of the population. And for a long time, what we would call the middle class, that is, people who don't have a title, who don't own great tracts of land, who are not part of the clergy, people who have like a skill or a profession, who live in the cities and towns, right, rather than out in the country where the food is grown. That's still a very tiny sliver of society, certainly through the Renaissance. I mean, there really was no middle class to speak of in the Middle Ages. No one would have used that term back then, right? But this is really, this period of time is when the term starts to have some more meaning, I would say. Cities are gradually growing larger, and the aristocracy, the nobility, they need, you know, with all this increased power, this centralized power that they have, they need lawyers, for example. They need bureaucrats, right? And these are drawn from the middle class because, of course, the nobility, remember, the thing about the nobility is they don't work. It was considered beneath them to work for a living, right? Even if they really needed the money, which some of them did, it was just, you know, a gentleman doesn't get his hands dirty working, even working at like a white collar job, even working as a lawyer or a physician. No. Only the commoners worked. But you had different levels of commoner, and at the very top level, I guess, of commoner would be the middle class, right? People in very skilled trades, people who are merchants, maybe who are bankers, who are lawyers, who are bureaucrats, physicians, stuff like this. What we would today consider like white-collar jobs, for the most part. These middle-class people, for a while now, by the time we get to 1600, right, they have been getting gradually more prosperous, although they still don't really have any political rights to speak of. They at least are becoming more prosperous. They are more needed by the nobility to do some of this kind of work that I've been talking about. And they are becoming better educated. Some of them are sending their children to universities. They have this sense of like striving, of wanting the next generation to do better than their own generation. Right? Again, this is a new concept really in the Renaissance. This is not something that really would have applied in the Middle Ages. The idea of, you know, maybe I am a lowly peasant, but someday you, my son, you might be a doctor. That's not really that's not how the medieval mind worked. This humanist attitude and what we might call the Protestant work ethic and all this, which has been at work in the Renaissance, extending into the Baroque era or the age of absolutism. So the middle class becomes important in terms of the arts because, for one thing, this period of time, the 1600s, is when the first public opera houses open and concert halls and theaters. In other words, the idea of going to a concert hall, paying some money, getting a ticket, going in and sitting down, right? That's not something that has always existed. That didn't really exist until the 1600s, right? And it existed, these theaters and opera houses, music halls, they were being built in cities because there was an audience there. There was an audience of middle-class people who wanted the finer things in life, who were prosperous enough, who had enough disposable income and cultural awareness that they too wanted to go to. Whereas before then, the kind of entertainment that I've been talking about, theater, music, what have you, dance, that was mostly confined to the nobility, and it was put on as a private performance within some nobleman's palace, right? Not something that was open to the public. And since there wasn't really much of a middle class, there wasn't a demand for that. Peasants out working out in the fields are not interested in going to the opera. I mean, they might like music, they might like their little peasant dances at harvest time, and someone getting up there and playing the violin as the peasants danced or whatever. It's not that they didn't enjoy music and dancing. It's that this kind of, formal presentation of quote unquote the arts was not available to anyone really but the nobility and maybe the clergy, I guess. But then again, too, sacred music, it's not for entertainment purposes, it's for worship purposes. So the idea of publicly available entertainment for the price of a ticket, that is a new thing in this time. And it's because there's a demand for it, because there's a middle class that is getting more prosperous and has the time and the inclination and the money to do this sort of thing. So that means that middle class tastes begin to be taken into account towards the end of the Baroque era especially. And so that means the middle class itself is an influence on the development of the arts. Now, I would say through most of this period, the influence of the nobility, the aristocracy, is still paramount, right? But it's worth, again, the book just mentions the middle class briefly, and that's a good thing. At least we're going to plant the idea of middle class participation in the arts, which is just starting now, because that's going to become very big as we get into the next era, the classical era. So we'll just kind of hold that thought until the next era. The middle class is slowly gaining in prosperity and influence within society. Not political influence, unfortunately. They still have no power. They can't vote. But okay. They also talk about it is helpful to think about the Baroque style against the backdrop of the scientific discoveries during the 17th and 18th centuries. This is this same era. If this was a history of science class, this might be called the era of the scientific revolution. Now, of course, the scientific revolution itself was made possible by many of the discoveries and the interest in discovery itself, which we saw in the Renaissance, right? So it's really the Renaissance, that the work done then, that paves the way for the scientific revolution to follow. And this, again, is something to sort of bookmark in your mind as we go forward, especially into the next historical era, the Enlightenment. And within the Enlightenment, we might refer to the classical period in music as being part of that larger historical era. All right, let's look at actually some of these paintings and sculptures and whatnot, and see if there are some characteristics of Baroque art that might also be found in music. Because after all, if we're going to use the term to apply to both the visual art of the time, or the architecture, or what have you, the literature, if we're going to use that same term to apply to music, there must be some commonalities between them, other than the fact that they occurred at the same time, right? And in fact, there are. So first off, let's look at this painting, J.L. and Cicera, by the Italian painter, female painter, by the way, Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a Baroque painter. So first of all, who are J.L. and Cicera? Well, Cicera was a commander of the Canaanites, I believe. This is from the book of Judges, I'm pretty sure. This is a scene from the Old Testament. So Sisera is a Canaanite general, and the Canaanites were the enemies of the Israelites. The Israelites defeat the Canaanites in battle, and Sisera, their general, kind of flees, runs away, because he sees the battle is lost. And as he is running away, trying to get as far from the Israelite army as possible, he goes by this little village, and this woman, Jael, sort of takes him in. Now, Jael knows who he is, but she doesn't let on. She says, "Oh, I can offer you shelter, and why don't you rest, and I'll feed you, whatever." And so he's like, "Oh, thank goodness. I can take refuge here before I continue fleeing." And while he is resting, Jael basically kills him, drives a tent spike through his head. And this scene is being depicted in this picture. Now, right off the bat, one thing about this scene is the subject matter. It's pretty shocking, right? The painting itself might not be shocking to us looking at, oh, she's just leaning about him, and yeah, I guess she's about to hammer something into his head. It would have been considered much more disturbing and shocking at this time in the early 1600s, because what has art looked like before that time, right? Well, it's remember that the paintings of the Renaissance of the Madonna and Child by Raphael. Now, some of the scenes on the in the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo are pretty disturbing. In some ways, Michelangelo was ahead of his time, in that Michelangelo, ahead of his time. He's back in the Renaissance, but many of Michelangelo's figures, especially in some of his later works and in some of his paintings, are often in some contorted, exaggerated pose. Like they're in the midst of moving. They aren't like posed in a sort of a classical, in a stable, dignified way. Now, some of his statues are the way. For example, look at Michelangelo's David, and you probably have a pretty good idea of Michelangelo's David just in your head. You can kind of conjure it up. It's the most famous statue of all time. And there's a picture of it on page 64. Michelangelo's David is standing in sort of a classical Greek pose. He's essentially at rest, but he's looking over at Goliath, and this is the moment before he takes the rock that's in his right hand and puts it in the sling that's hanging over his left shoulder, and he's going to do his thing and kill Goliath. But Michelangelo, and he carved this when he was in his early 20s, I believe, is depicting the moment before the action happens, like a moment of contemplation. David is looking at Goliath and contemplating what he's about to do. This is the moment before he starts to act. Now look at Bernini's statue of David. This is a Baroque, and this is very characteristic of Bernini's style. Right? This was carved in 1623. Now David is twisted around, and he's in the act of flinging this thing. He's getting ready to, and the expression on his face, you can see he's straining, right? It's much more of an action pose, and it's much more dynamic, we might say. This is true of Baroque painting in general, Baroque statues. There's more dynamic motion and less of this sort of static, dignified posing of the type that we more associate with Renaissance, which in itself was an imitation of ancient Greek and Roman practice. So, getting back again to Jael and Sisera, this is a painting of someone about to be murdered. You don't find a lot of paintings of murder in the Renaissance. It would be considered kind of disturbing and gross. But the idea of the Baroque is we are not, beauty is important, certainly. The Baroque artist might say, beauty is obviously important and everything we do must be done beautifully. But let's face it, if beauty is your number one priority, then the art that you produce might not affect the emotions of the observer or the listener in the case of a piece of music. And the number one priority for the Baroque artist, and I'm speaking in gross generalizations, right? I'm trying to generalize the attitudes of thousands of Baroque artists, composers, what have you. But I think it's fair to say that their general attitude was the most important thing is not some idealized, pure notion of beauty. The most important thing is to get an emotional response from your viewer, from your listener, to affect the emotions. And beauty sometimes has to take a back seat to that, right? So if we look at some very serene, peaceful pose of within a Baroque statue, a Baroque Renaissance statue or painting, it's not going to affect us as much. It's just a question of different priorities. And the priority for the Baroque artist is getting an emotional response, right? And so that's why we might do something unconventional, like paint an imminent murder, a gruesome, bloody murder. It's going to get the heart stirring, especially again from the perspective of the times coming before, and people, this was shocking in its day, right? And this is why, again, tying back to that meaning of the word Baroque, it's sort of, there's something exaggerated about it, something over the top, right? Something even maybe a touch of ugliness. After all, murder is an ugly thing. How can you paint an ugly thing in a beautiful way? Well, that's the wonderful contradiction at the heart of the Baroque style, right? Okay, I think, and anyway, so kind of keep that in mind as we now start to talk about the music, how all of that, and keep the framing, the big picture, keep that mind Baroque, that word Baroque in your mind, and pay attention to how many times each of the different musical characteristics I'm going to talk about can sort of plug in to that concept of Baroqueness, right? Okay. So now, getting into the music a little bit, they give sort of an overview on page 104, and I will give an overview now, I think, as well. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that this unit is going to be longer than the previous 2 units. Even though it's 150 years, it's the same period of time as, let's say, the Renaissance, right? And a much shorter period of time than the medieval. There's more to talk about here because there's just kind of like more going on within the field of music. There are actually little sub-eras within the Baroque. There's an early, middle, and late. That doesn't really apply to, let's say, the Renaissance in the same way. There isn't really so much an early Renaissance style, a middle Renaissance style, and a late Renaissance style. I mean, some people might use those terms, but the style of the Renaissance was sort of like so refined and so logically perfect in a sense that it didn't need to evolve and change. And it didn't really evolve and change that much. There were these sort of rules that composers followed. There were these standard practices that were taught, that were followed pretty rigidly by most composers, with the result being that an early Renaissance composer like Josquin, right, whose works we listen to, the greatest composer of the early Renaissance, it sounds quite a bit like the greatest composer of the late Renaissance, Palestrina. The style was kind of like perfect even at the outset. Now, this is, again, a generalization, but it was such a perfect style, it didn't need to evolve. And in fact, if it evolved and changed gradually over time, it couldn't be perfect, right? If that which is perfect, it does not need to change. And that's my way of thinking of the Renaissance style. It was sort of like it was already perfect, it didn't need to change and evolve. Instead, it had to be kind of rejected altogether. And that's what we see that in the beginning of the Baroque. There is a conscious effort or a conscious initiative on the part of some composers, especially Monteverdi, who is the most important figure at the beginning of the Baroque. He is sort of like, think of him as like the Beethoven of the Baroque, in that he is kind of overturning, rejecting many elements of the previous style and kind of causing a revolution. He is like the pivotal figure from the end of the Renaissance to the beginning of the Baroque. So there are there are some composers who consciously take up this new style. There's kind of a clean break, okay, that happens from the Renaissance style to the Baroque style. Many composers eagerly adopt this new style, all of these practices, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But there are some who say, I don't like this new way of doing things. I'm going to continue on in the old perfect way of the Renaissance style. And so there are some, now these composers aren't nearly as famous. Most of them are maybe working within the Catholic Church, which is a conservative institution which doesn't, change very quickly. The Renaissance style kind of persists in the background for a long time, for well into the Baroque era. But those composers are considered kind of old-fashioned, and they aren't nearly as... None of the composers that we are going to study still cling to that older Renaissance style. So it's not really an evolution from the Renaissance to the Baroque, it's a revolution. And again, the most important figure at the start of that revolution is Monteverdi, and we'll talk about why when we get to them. But all of that was a tangent from my telling you there's more to this unit than in the previous unit. It's going to be a little bit longer. There's going to be more terms and more facts to keep track of. So there is an early, middle, and late. I don't need for you to memorize the dates of the early, middle, and late on the test or anything. Just be aware there is an evolution in the style. I would say that the main things, the main couple of things that change over the course of the Baroque, there are two main things. There's lots of other little things, but keep in mind these two. These are something that I might test you on. So number one, over the course of the Baroque era, instrumental music becomes gradually more and more and more important, such that by the time we get to the late Baroque, instrumental music is overall, what do I mean by important? I mean composers spend more of their time writing instrumental music than vocal music. And also, even that vocal music which is produced, like opera, for example, or like oratorios or cantatas, etc., it's no longer pure a cappella vocal music. It's voices and instruments together. So again, this illustrates the importance of instruments. The a cappella style is something we associate with that older Renaissance style, which has gone out of fashion and has sort of gone underground. Yes, there are lots of people still composing a cappella vocal music, masses, motets, etc. But they're the old-fashioned composers. The new style, what the audiences want, whether they are members of the nobility, kings and queens, or let's say middle-class people going to opera houses in the cities, what they want is instruments and voices together, or just instrumental music even. Also, keep in mind that, again, it's still considered the mark of an educated person, one of the marks of an educated person, to know how to play an instrument. And both the nobility and the middle class now are giving their children music lessons. They are buying musical instruments. They have music at home, even in middle class homes. Because that's, again, there were no stereo systems. There was no Spotify or iTunes or whatever. If you liked music, there were two choices open to you. You could go to a concert hall and listen to music or whatever, or you could create it at home. So having a harpsichord in your house, having children who could sing or play that was like your home entertainment system right there. Okay. So there's more to this period. I said, so one of the things that changes from this early to the middle to the late is the growing importance of instrumental music. The other thing is the musical texture changes gradually. The prevailing musical texture, which is in fashion. Now remember, which texture did we have in our previous era? We want to compare, we want to contrast what is new about this new era compared to what came before. The prevailing texture of Renaissance music was polyphonic. That was considered, that if you are a skilled composer, that was considered, the predominant texture for learned men to compose in. Now, there was some homophonic music as well, like in madrigals, in lute songs, like in secular entertainment type music, but for like serious music, polyphonic texture was the way to go. One of the ways that this new style makes a break from the older Renaissance style is beginning in the Baroque era. The avant-garde composers, people like Monteverdi, decide, you know what, enough with the polyphonic texture, especially in vocal music, because if you have people singing different lines in the same words but in different independent lines simultaneously, you can't understand the meaning of the words. It obscures the meaning of the words. So I, Monteverdi, in my operas, this new art form that I didn't single-handedly invent, but I was part of the creation. I, Monteverdi, speaking like I'm Monteverdi. Monteverdi is the earliest significant composer of opera, the first great composer of opera. And his conception of opera was the drama is really more important than the music itself. The music is there to serve the drama. The idea is to have this drama which will affect people's emotions, right? That's what the Baroque is all about, getting an emotional response. If people can't understand the words that the character is singing on stage, how are they going to feel what they are supposed to feel? So we have to simplify the texture. What we should have is homophonic texture. The instruments are going to be playing an accompaniment, which is going to be fairly simple, and the singer has a melody, and that melody is the most important thing. It's clearly out front and center, and we should make it so the words are easy to understand. We should certainly use text painting to try and reinforce the meaning of the words musically. But if people can't understand the text, then they won't feel the correct emotions. So this is the impetus behind this dramatic change in texture, and Monteverdi being a cutting-edge figure, he was very influential on other composers. So at the beginning of the Baroque era, with the invention of opera, we see a shift to the prevailing texture being homophonic. Not just in opera, but in really many other genres of music, because opera was so influential on those other genres. Opera was like the big leagues, okay? And or you could think of it as opera was sort of like the movies. It was really once it became something available to the middle class with the opening of the first public opera houses in like the 1630s, opera became middle class entertainment like the movies. It's what people had back then instead of the movies. So in the same way that the movies influence other types of visual entertainment like TV or even TV commercials or music videos or whatever, movies are very influential on those other lesser or less large scale, those minor league, we might think, genres. Opera was influential on all other genres of music because it was a sensation, when it came out. Okay, so we start the Baroque era with a prevailing texture that is homophonic. That's part of this new style. As we get to the middle Baroque and the late Baroque, the style gets increasingly polyphonic again, especially as instruments, or this is the other part of it, as instrumental music becomes more important than vocal, and maybe there's not as much need to understand the words, which is the original idea behind homophonic texture, because there are no words, because we're writing more and more for instruments now, and composers somehow can't help themselves. They like to have multiple melodies going on at the same time. It's a challenge for the composer. It's something that they like to do. And so over time, the musical texture gets kind of cluttered up with additional layers of melody again, so that by the time we get to the late Baroque, especially the style of J.S. Bach, the texture is very often thoroughly polyphonic again. Almost all of J.S. Bach's music, not all, but so much of it is polyphonic in texture. That seems to be just sort of the way his mind worked. He thought in terms of what we call counterpoint, melody against melody, right? And we will see, for example, one of the very important genres of this time, the fugue. A fugue is simply a polyphonic work, usually for a keyboard instrument. It doesn't have to be, but it's an instrumental work in which we have multiple, it is polyphonic by nature, we have multiple layers of melody going on. We have a main melody called a subject, which appears in the different strata, the different sort of like voice parts, right? And J.S. Bach was the ultimate master of the fugue, which many composers I have long considered the fugue to be like the most difficult type of piece to write, actually. So getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but just to illustrate this point of one of the things that changes as the Baroque style evolves over this 150-year period is we get from a prevailingly homophonic texture to ultimately a prevailingly polyphonic texture. What's interesting is what happens after that in the classical era. Again, the composers decide, oh, it's too much, it's too busy, it's too complex, it's too demanding on the ear, all of these melodies going on at the same time. Why don't we go back to a simple homophonic texture? So there's you might see as we go through these different eras, there's sort of a pendulum that swings back and forth in the arts, just kind of like there is in politics, right? We go from, 8 years of the Republicans in power and people get sick of them. Then we have 8 years or whatever of the Democrats. Usually it's 8 years, not always. And people get sick of them. They wear out their welcome and it goes back and forth. Action, reaction. Same thing in the arts. We go from periods in the arts where maybe we have a conception of pure beauty, which is prevalent, which is the number one priority of the artist. This is like the Renaissance, right? Of beauty and balance and proportion and symmetry as being the key ingredients of beauty. And then over time, new generations of artists come up and they rebel against that somewhat and they say, no, the most important thing is emotion, getting an emotional response, right? And we might have to sacrifice some beauty for the sake of that. And then that might give way and the pendulum swings the other way and there's more interest in form, in notions of balance and symmetry and proportion and all that, right? But this Baroque era that we're in, there's a willingness to have things be disproportionate, to be exaggerated, to be even maybe on the verge of grotesque. So again, tying us back into that word. I see that I am running short of time, so let's talk about these characteristics of Baroque music and also maybe talk about some different genres of Baroque music next time. See you then.